Before the crisis, the universe still believed in continuity, not as a philosophical certainty, but as an operational assumption. Worlds expanded under the quiet premise that existence moved forward, not sideways, not backward, and certainly not into oblivion. Civilizations rose and fell, yes, but always within the boundaries of a persistent reality. Even destruction had limits. A planet could be shattered, a timeline fractured, a hero erased, but the stage itself remained intact. The arena held. The structure endured. There was an implicit trust in the architecture of existence, something so fundamental it rarely needed articulation. Heroes fought to preserve worlds, not because they doubted the fabric of reality, but because they assumed it was stable enough to be defended. Villains sought domination, not annihilation, because power required something to rule over. Even chaos had a frame. Even entropy operated within a system that allowed for resistance. This was the unspoken law. Reality persists. And then something emerged that did not recognize that law. Not as a rebellion against it, not as an exception, but as a force that simply did not acknowledge its validity. The anti-monitor does not conquer. He does not corrupt. He does not reshape. He erases. Entire universes collapse into silence, not as a consequence of failure or moral decay, but as a natural extension of his existence. His presence does not distort reality. It negates it. This is not conflict in the traditional sense. There is no negotiation, no escalation, no strategic counterbalance. The battlefield itself dissolves. The territory vanishes before it can be contested. What remains is not defeat, but absence. And that changes everything. Because once a universe can be erased, the concept of permanence fractures. Memory becomes unstable. Identity begins to drift. History, once perceived as a linear accumulation of events, reveals itself as something far more fragile, something that can be overwritten without trace. The past is no longer a foundation. It is a version. Within this context, the event known as Crisis on Infinite Earths does not function as a catastrophe in the conventional sense. It operates as an ontological rupture, a systemic collapse of continuity itself. Worlds are not destroyed in sequence, they are removed from the structure entirely, leaving behind a reality that continues as if nothing was lost, even though everything was. That is where the true tension begins, because survival in this framework is no longer defined by endurance. It is defined by selection. Some realities persist, others do not, and those who remain are left with a paradox that cannot be resolved through action alone. They exist in a universe that has already been erased once, rebuilt from fragments, stitched together through an invisible process that few can fully comprehend. The structure holds again, but something is different. There are echoes where there should be silence, gaps where continuity should exist, a subtle dissonance between what is remembered and what is officially recorded. The new reality presents itself as whole, but it carries the weight of something unresolved, something buried beneath its surface. For most, this dissonance never reaches consciousness. Life continues. Systems stabilize. The illusion of permanence reasserts itself. But for some, the awareness remains. A quiet recognition that what exists now is not original, but derivative. Not continuous, but reconstructed. And that awareness introduces a form of trauma that cannot be easily categorized. It is not the trauma of loss, because loss implies memory. It is not the trauma of destruction, because destruction implies aftermath. This is something else. A trauma without a clear event, without a stable reference point, without a shared acknowledgement. A fracture that exists beneath the narrative, not within it. To know that your universe has been erased is one thing. To continue living in its replacement is another. Because the question that emerges is not simply how to survive such an event, but how to remain coherent within it. How to maintain a sense of identity when the ground beneath that identity has already been rewritten. How to trust memory when memory itself may be a constructed artifact of a reality that no longer exists. And more importantly, whether it is even possible to function with that awareness intact. There is a threshold here, a line between knowing and not knowing, between integrating the rupture and suppressing it, between confronting the instability of existence and choosing the illusion of continuity. Some cross that line, others cannot. The heroes who confront the anti-monitor are not merely facing an external threat. They are encountering the limits of their own conceptual framework. Their training, their morality, their understanding of conflict, none of it prepares them for an enemy that does not operate within the logic of opposition. You cannot outmaneuver erasure. You cannot resist absence. You can only delay it, and even that is uncertain. This transforms the nature of heroism itself, no longer defined by victory or defeat, but by persistence in the face of inevitability. A refusal to accept that existence can be nullified without resistance, even when resistance has no guarantee of success. The battlefield becomes abstract. The stakes become absolute. Because when destruction becomes a natural force rather than a moral choice, the entire ethical framework shifts. There is no villainy in the traditional sense, no intention to interrogate, no ideology to dismantle. The anti-monitor does not hate. He does not desire. He simply is. A gravitational force pulling reality toward non-existence. A pressure that cannot be reasoned with because it does not originate from thought or intention. It originates from structure, and that is what makes it unbearable. Because if destruction is structural, then survival is contingent. Not earned, not deserved. Contingent. A matter of alignment within a system that can collapse without warning. That realization strips away the comforting narratives of justice, of balance, of moral causality. What remains is something colder, something more precise. Existence is not guaranteed, and once that idea enters the system, it cannot be removed. It lingers. It reshapes perception. It alters the way reality is experienced, even if only at the edges of awareness. The city still stands. The world still turns. The heroes still act. But beneath it all, there is a quiet recognition that everything is provisional, temporary, replaceable. The universe continues, but it no longer feels permanent. Long before the first universe collapsed into silence, the multiverse operated as a distributed system of realities, each with its own internal logic, its own continuity, its own version of order. These worlds did not merely coexist. They mirrored, diverged, echoed one another across an infinite spectrum of possibility. Identity, in this context, was not singular. It was plural, refracted through variations that preserved a core while allowing for divergence. A hero was not just one figure, but many, each shaped by different pressures, different histories, different outcomes. This multiplicity created a strange kind of stability. Not the stability of permanence, but the stability of redundancy. If one world fell, others remained. If one version of a hero failed, another persisted. The structure did not depend on any single reality. It distributed its weight across countless iterations. This is what allowed the system to feel resilient, even when individual components were fragile. Within this architecture, the concept of self was already more fluid than it appeared. A person could exist in multiple forms, each legitimate, each real within its own context. The boundary between identity and variation was porous. Yet this did not generate anxiety. It was normalized, absorbed into the broader logic of the multiverse. Continuity was not linear, but it was still continuous. The anti-monitor emerges as a direct inversion of that structure, not as a being within the system, but as something that exposes its underlying vulnerability. Where the multiverse disperses identity across infinite variations, he collapses it into nothing. Where the system relies on redundancy, he removes entire layers of existence, reducing the network until there is nothing left to distribute. His function is not to oppose multiplicity, but to render it irrelevant. This is what differentiates him from traditional antagonists. He does not represent an alternative ideology or a competing vision of order. He represents the absence of both. There is no negotiation because there is no position to negotiate from. His presence is not a challenge to the system. It is a demonstration that the system can be undone. And that realization begins to destabilize the psychological foundations of every character involved. Heroes, by definition, operate within a framework of causality. Actions produce consequences. Effort leads to outcome. Sacrifice has meaning because it influences the trajectory of events. Even in failure, there is a sense of continuity. Something is learned, something is preserved, something moves forward. But when entire universes can be erased, that chain of causality fractures. What does sacrifice mean if the world it protects can be removed from existence entirely? What does victory look like when the enemy does not occupy territory, does not maintain a position, does not even require persistence in the conventional sense? The anti-monitor does not need to win. He only needs to continue existing long enough for everything else to stop. This introduces a psychological dissonance that cannot be resolved through conventional heroism, because the framework itself is compromised. Within the event of crisis on infinite Earths, this dissonance manifests not only in the scale of destruction, but in the restructuring of reality that follows. The multiverse collapses into a single, consolidated universe. Infinite variations are reduced to one continuity. Redundancy is eliminated. The system simplifies itself in response to the threat. On the surface, this appears as stabilization, a return to order, a restoration of coherence. But beneath that, something essential has been lost. The multiplicity that once allowed identity to exist across variations is gone. There are no longer infinite versions of a hero, each exploring different aspects of the same core. There is only one. One history, one timeline, one narrative. The compression of reality into a singular continuity creates the illusion of clarity, but it also introduces a new form of fragility. Because now there is no redundancy. If this universe falls, there is no parallel structure to absorb the impact. The system has concentrated itself. It has removed its own buffer. In doing so, it has increased the stakes of existence to an absolute level. Everything now depends on the persistence of a single continuity. This shift is not merely structural. It is psychological. Characters who retain awareness of the pre-crisis multiverse experience a form of cognitive dislocation. They remember variations that no longer exist. They carry knowledge that cannot be verified within the current reality. Their internal sense of continuity does not align with the external structure of the world. This creates a split between memory and environment. A hero may remember multiple lives, multiple versions of events, multiple outcomes that have all been erased or merged into a single narrative. But the world around them recognizes only one version. The official history has been rewritten. The past has been consolidated. This is where trauma begins to take a different form. It is not the trauma of witnessing destruction alone. It is the trauma of carrying memory that has no place within the current reality. A memory that cannot be shared, cannot be validated, cannot be integrated into the collective narrative. It becomes isolated, internalized, detached from the social fabric that typically allows trauma to be processed. In this sense, the post-crisis universe functions as a kind of enforced amnesia. Most characters do not remember what was lost. They continue their lives within the new continuity as if it has always been this way. The system protects itself by removing awareness of its own collapse. Stability is maintained through forgetting. But for those who remember, stability becomes impossible, because they are forced to reconcile two incompatible realities, the one that exists and the one that was erased. They exist in a space between versions, unable to fully inhabit either. Their identity becomes layered, not in the multiplicity of the multiverse, but in the tension between memory and present existence. This is not a visible conflict. It does not manifest in battles or external actions. It operates beneath the surface, shaping perception, influencing decisions, altering the way these characters relate to the world around them. And it introduces a fundamental question. Can a system truly recover from being rewritten if the memory of its previous state persists within its components? The answer is not straightforward, because recovery, in this context, would require a form of integration that the system actively resists. To acknowledge the previous multiverse would be to destabilize the current continuity. It would reintroduce multiplicity into a structure that has been simplified for the sake of survival. So the system suppresses that knowledge. It isolates it within a few individuals, contains it, prevents it from spreading. The new universe maintains its coherence by refusing to engage with its own history. It presents itself as original, as continuous, as stable. But the fracture remains. And it is within this fracture that the deeper psychological dynamics of the crisis begin to unfold. Because the anti-monitor does not simply destroy worlds. He reveals that they can be destroyed. He introduces the possibility of absolute erasure into a system that previously operated under the assumption of persistence. That possibility does not disappear when he is defeated. It lingers. It becomes part of the structure. The heroes who survive the crisis are not returning to the same world they left. They are entering a new one, built on the knowledge that everything can be undone. Their role shifts, subtly but irrevocably. They are no longer just protectors of their world. They are guardians of its continuity, aware that continuity itself is fragile. This awareness changes the way they act. Decisions carry a different weight. Conflicts are no longer localized. The scale of consequence expands. Every action exists within the shadow of a possibility that cannot be fully controlled. The idea that reality itself can collapse becomes an underlying pressure, shaping behavior even when it is not explicitly acknowledged. And this pressure extends beyond the characters themselves. It reaches into the audience, because Crisis on Infinite Earths does not only restructure the fictional universe. It restructures the relationship between the audience and the narrative. Readers become aware that continuity is not fixed, that stories can be rewritten, that entire histories can be erased and replaced. The boundary between narrative and meta-narrative begins to blur. What is canon? What is real within the story? What persists? These questions become part of the experience. And in that sense, the crisis operates on two levels simultaneously. Within the narrative, it is the collapse and reconstruction of reality. Outside the narrative, it is the exposure of storytelling itself as a system that can be rewritten, restructured, redefined. The anti-monitor, then, is not just a force within the story. He is a manifestation of that deeper instability. A reminder that the structures we rely on, whether they are worlds, identities, or narratives, are not as fixed as they appear. That they can be dismantled, replaced, and reassembled according to forces that operate beyond the immediate frame of perception. And once that reminder is introduced, it cannot be removed. It becomes part of the foundation. The universe stabilizes. The heroes continue. The story moves forward. But beneath it all, the awareness remains. Reality has already ended once, and it continues anyway. The first universes do not fall with spectacle. They disappear. There is no gradual collapse, no visible erosion of structure, no sequence of escalating signs that something is wrong. Entire realities vanish as if they had never occupied space at all. Cities, histories, entire civilizations, reduced not to ruins but to absence. The system does not register debris. It registers subtraction. What once existed is no longer accessible, not even as memory within the fabric of the multiverse itself. This is the initial fracture, because the architecture of reality had always allowed for destruction, but never for removal without residue. Even the most catastrophic events left traces. Scars in space, echoes in time, fragments that could be studied, understood, integrated into the broader continuity. But here, there is nothing to analyze, no aftermath to interpret. The structure simply closes over the gap, as if compensating for a loss it cannot acknowledge. The heroes begin to notice inconsistencies before they understand their cause, not through direct observation of destruction, but through absence of reference. Worlds that should exist no longer do. Signals go unanswered. Pathways between realities terminate abruptly. What once functioned as a vast network of interconnected universes begins to fragment into isolated nodes, each unaware of how many others have already been removed. This is not yet panic. It is confusion, because the scale of the event has not been fully grasped. The system is still attempting to interpret the anomaly within its existing framework. Perhaps these worlds have shifted. Perhaps they are inaccessible. Perhaps the pathways have been disrupted. The assumption of persistence remains intact, even as the evidence begins to contradict it. Then the pattern becomes undeniable. Multiple universes disappear in succession, each loss accelerating the next. The rate of erasure increases. The intervals between disappearances shorten. What initially appeared as isolated anomalies reveals itself as a coordinated collapse, driven by a force that operates beyond the perceptual limits of those within the system. This is where the anti-monitor becomes visible, not as a figure in the conventional sense, but as a presence defined by its effects. A gravitational center of absence, pulling entire realities into non-existence. His emergence is not marked by confrontation, but by the recognition that the system is no longer self-contained. There is something external to its logic, something that does not follow its rules. The response, at first, is to contain. Heroes and cosmic entities attempt to stabilize the remaining universes, to reinforce the boundaries, to protect what still exists. Defensive strategies are deployed. Energy fields, barriers, attempts to isolate the threat. The logic is familiar. When faced with destruction, reinforce structure. When faced with invasion, defend territory. But there is no territory to defend, because the anti-monitor does not advance across space. He collapses it. There is no front line, no perimeter, no edge where resistance can be organized. Each universe exists as an isolated point, vulnerable from within as much as from without. The concept of defense begins to lose its meaning. This forces a shift in strategy. If the threat cannot be contained spatially, it must be confronted structurally. The heroes begin to understand that the anti-monitor is not targeting individual worlds, but the underlying framework that allows those worlds to exist. His actions are not random. They follow a logic that operates at a deeper level of reality, one that the heroes are only beginning to perceive. And that realization introduces the first true polarization. Some seek to understand the structure, to analyze, to map, to identify the pattern behind the erasures. They operate under the belief that knowledge can provide leverage, that if the system can be understood, it can be manipulated or defended. Their approach is analytical, methodical, focused on uncovering the rules that govern this new form of destruction. Others reject this approach, not out of ignorance, but out of recognition that the system itself may be compromised beyond comprehension. They shift toward action, toward direct confrontation, even if the nature of the enemy makes such confrontation almost impossible. For them, the act of resistance becomes its own justification. To do nothing is to accept erasure. To act, even without certainty, is to assert existence against a force that denies it. This division is not clean. It is not ideological in a traditional sense. It is a divergence in how to respond to a threat that undermines the very concept of response. Analysis versus action. understanding versus defiance. Both approaches emerge from the same recognition that the existing framework is insufficient. As the universes continue to disappear, the pressure intensifies. Time compresses. Decisions must be made with incomplete information, under conditions that change faster than they can be understood. The scale of the crisis expands beyond any previous conflict. It is no longer about saving individual worlds. It is about preserving the possibility of worlds existing at all. And this is where the narrative begins to accelerate. Alliances form across realities that have never interacted before. Heroes who exist as variations of the same identity encounter one another, forced to confront the multiplicity of their own existence. The redundancy that once provided stability now becomes a source of urgency. Each version represents a fragment of something that may soon be lost. There is no time to reconcile these differences, because the system is collapsing faster than identity can be negotiated. The presence of multiple versions of the same hero does not create unity. It creates tension. Each carries a different history, a different set of decisions, a different understanding of what it means to act. And now they must operate within a shared context, under conditions that do not allow for resolution. This introduces a subtle but significant shift in perception. The idea of a singular, coherent identity begins to fragment. If multiple versions of the same hero can exist simultaneously, and if some of those versions are erased while others persist, what defines the core of that identity? Is it the actions taken, the memories retained, the version that survives? Or is identity itself contingent on the structure that allows it to exist? As the crisis progresses, these questions move from abstraction to immediacy, because survival is no longer guaranteed, even for those who have always been central to the narrative. Characters who were previously stable points within the system begin to disappear, not as a result of failure, but as a consequence of the system itself collapsing. Their absence is not framed as loss within the story. It is a removal from the story entirely. This disrupts the audience's perception as much as the characters, because the implicit contract of continuity is broken. The assumption that certain figures will persist, that the narrative will maintain its core, is no longer valid. The story becomes unstable, unpredictable in a way that cannot be resolved through expectation or familiarity, and this instability feeds back into the narrative. Characters begin to operate with an awareness that their actions may not have lasting impact, that the world they are trying to save may not exist long enough for their efforts to matter. This does not lead to inaction. It leads to a different kind of action, one that is not based on outcome but on assertion. To act, even when the result is uncertain. To resist, even when resistance may not be remembered. To preserve something, even if that something cannot be guaranteed continuity. This is where the conflict shifts from external to structural. The anti-monitor continues his function, erasing universes with increasing efficiency. The heroes continue their efforts, adapting strategies, forming alliances, attempting to understand a system that is collapsing faster than it can be analyzed. But beneath these actions, a deeper transformation is occurring. The very meaning of existence within this narrative is being redefined. Because once reality can be erased, existence is no longer a given. It becomes something that must be actively maintained, moment by moment, against a force that does not recognize its value. The act of being becomes a form of resistance, and that resistance begins to take on a new significance, not as a means to victory, but as a way to assert that existence, even if temporary, even if fragile, even if ultimately unsustainable, still carries weight. That the act of continuing, in the face of inevitable erasure, is itself a form of meaning. The crisis does not yet resolve, but the structure of the conflict has been established. The system is collapsing. The enemy cannot be confronted through conventional means. The heroes are forced to operate within a framework that no longer guarantees continuity. And the awareness of that instability begins to reshape everything that follows. The escalation does not arrive as a turning point. It emerges as a compression of inevitability. By the time the remaining universes begin to cluster around one another, drawn into fragile alignments in an attempt to preserve what is left, the crisis has already passed the threshold where reversal is possible. The objective is no longer preservation of multiplicity. It is containment of extinction. Entire realities are repositioned, anchored to points of relative stability, forming a diminishing field of existence surrounded by absence. This is not strategy in the traditional sense. It is adaptation under pressure. The anti-monitor continues to operate without deviation, his function accelerating as resistance intensifies. Each attempt to stabilize the remaining universes produces only temporary delay. The system is not fighting back in a way that disrupts him. It is rearranging itself to survive longer within his trajectory. And that distinction begins to matter, because survival in this context becomes detached from victory. The heroes are no longer attempting to defeat the anti-monitor in a definitive sense. They are attempting to extend the duration of existence, to create pockets of continuity within a collapsing structure. Time itself becomes the resource they are fighting for, measured not in years or generations, but in moments of continued presence. This shift reframes the nature of action. Efforts that would once be considered insufficient or temporary take on new significance. A delay is no longer a failure to resolve the conflict. It is a meaningful extension of existence. Each universe that persists for even a fraction longer contributes to the overall resistance, not by altering the outcome, but by asserting continuity against erasure. This introduces a new layer of psychological strain, because the heroes must operate with the knowledge that their actions are not building toward a resolution, but toward a postponement. The traditional arc of conflict, escalation leading to confrontation leading to resolution, no longer applies. The narrative becomes recursive, each effort leading back to the same point, the same pressure, the same inevitability. And yet they continue, not because they believe in a final victory, but because the act of continuing becomes the only available form of resistance. This persistence begins to take on a symbolic weight that exceeds its practical effect. It is no longer about what can be achieved. It is about what can be sustained. Within this environment, the structure of identity begins to shift again. The multiplicity that once defined the multiverse is now collapsing into singularity. Versions of characters are merging, overlapping, being consolidated into unified forms that carry fragments of multiple histories. This process is not clean. It does not preserve continuity in a linear way. It compresses it, folding different timelines into a single narrative that must function as if it has always been coherent. This creates a layered identity. Characters begin to exist with traces of lives that never fully happened within the current continuity. Memories that feel real but cannot be placed within the official structure of the world. Decisions that seem to have been made, relationships that seem to have existed, all compressed into a single version that must operate within a simplified reality. This is not integration. It is compression under pressure, and it produces a subtle form of dissonance. The self becomes less defined by a continuous history and more by a set of overlapping impressions. Identity becomes a composite, assembled from fragments that do not fully align. The heroes must function within this state, making decisions, taking action, maintaining coherence, even as the foundation of their identity becomes increasingly unstable. This instability is not acknowledged openly, because the system does not allow for it. The newly formed universe presents itself as singular and continuous. It does not recognize the multiplicity that preceded it. It does not accommodate the fragments that remain within certain individuals. The official narrative is one of unity, of consolidation, of restored order. But beneath that narrative, the fractures persist, and they begin to influence behavior in subtle ways. Decisions carry echoes of alternative outcomes. Responses are shaped by impressions that cannot be fully traced. There is a sense of familiarity with events that have not occurred within this continuity, a recognition of patterns that seem to repeat without clear origin. This creates a form of intuitive dislocation. The heroes act with a kind of knowledge that does not belong to the present reality, but cannot be ignored. It informs their actions without being fully accessible. It shapes their perception without being consciously articulated. And this introduces a new tension, because the system is attempting to stabilize itself through simplification, while the individuals within it carry the complexity of what has been lost. The more the universe asserts its coherence, the more the underlying dissonance becomes pronounced for those who can perceive it. This tension reaches a critical point as the final stages of the crisis unfold. The remaining universes are drawn into a single point of convergence, a last attempt to preserve existence by collapsing multiplicity into unity. This convergence is not a solution. It is a final configuration, a state in which the system can continue, but only in a reduced form. The anti-monitor, in response, does not alter his function. He continues to erase. But now the scale has changed. There are no longer infinite targets. There is a single structure, a consolidated universe that contains within it the remnants of all that came before. The conflict shifts from distributed erasure to focused annihilation. The pressure intensifies not because the anti-monitor becomes more aggressive, but because the system has concentrated itself. There is nowhere left to retreat. This is where confrontation becomes unavoidable. Not in the sense of a traditional battle, but in the sense that the system can no longer absorb the impact of erasure through distribution. It must now resist directly, with all that remains. The heroes gather, not as representatives of separate worlds, but as components of a single continuity that is about to be tested at its limit. The nature of this confrontation is fundamentally different from previous conflicts. It is not about defeating an opponent through superior strategy or power. It is about interrupting a process that operates at a structural level. The anti-monitor is not a target to be eliminated in a conventional sense. He is a function that must be disrupted, and that disruption requires a form of action that transcends individual capability. Sacrifice, in this context, takes on a different meaning. It is no longer about trading one life for many, or enduring loss for the sake of a greater outcome. It becomes a structural intervention. Certain actions are taken not because they guarantee success, but because they alter the configuration of the system in a way that creates the possibility of continuation. These actions are irreversible. They do not restore what has been lost. They do not preserve the multiverse. They create a new state, one that can exist, but only by accepting the elimination of everything that cannot be contained within it. This is the moment where the crisis transitions from collapse to reconfiguration. The anti-monitor is confronted, not as a villain to be defeated, but as a force whose function must be countered through equally fundamental means. The resolution does not come through domination, but through alteration of the system itself. And when it is over, the universe remains. But it is not the same. It is smaller, simpler, more fragile. The multiplicity is gone. The redundancy is gone. The vast network of realities has been reduced to a single thread, stretched across a structure that has already proven it can be undone. And those who remain must now exist within that thread, carrying with them the fragments of what was lost, the awareness of what has been erased, and the knowledge that the system they inhabit is not as stable as it appears. The crisis has ended, but its effects have not. What follows the apparent resolution is not stability. It is adjustment under a new constraint. The universe that remains after the crisis presents itself as continuous, singular, and internally coherent. Its geography is intact, its histories appear aligned, its systems function without visible fracture. From the outside, it resembles restoration. The arena stands, the structures hold, the narrative resumes its forward motion. But this continuity is not inherited. It is assembled. The difference is subtle, yet decisive. What exists now is not the continuation of what came before, but a constructed alignment of fragments that have been forced into compatibility. The past has not been preserved. It has been curated. Events that once belonged to separate realities are now integrated into a single timeline, their contradictions smoothed over, their inconsistencies absorbed into a narrative that must function as if it has always been whole. This process does not eliminate tension. It conceals it, because the compression of multiple histories into one does not resolve their differences. It layers them. Beneath the surface of this new continuity, there are competing versions of events, overlapping identities, traces of realities that no longer officially exist, but continue to exert influence at the level of perception and behavior. This creates a condition in which the present is stable, but the foundation is unstable. Characters move through a world that appears consistent, yet carries within it the unresolved weight of multiple pasts. For most, this instability remains inaccessible. Their experience of reality is coherent. Their memories align with the official history. The system functions precisely because it filters out the fragments that would disrupt its continuity. But for those who retain awareness, the situation is different. They experience the world as a surface stretched over something deeper, something that does not fully conform to the narrative presented. Their memories do not align cleanly with the current continuity. They recall events that have no place within this version of reality, relationships that no longer exist, outcomes that have been overwritten. This produces a form of cognitive layering. They are not simply remembering the past. They are holding multiple pasts simultaneously, each with its own internal coherence, each incompatible with the others. Their identity becomes distributed across these layers, no longer anchored to a single, stable history. And yet, they must function. This introduces a new form of psychological discipline. To operate within the current reality requires a form of selective alignment. Certain memories must be suppressed, not erased, but set aside. Certain inconsistencies must be ignored, not resolved. The individual must choose, continuously, which version of reality to engage with, even as other versions remain present within their awareness. This is not denial. It is adaptation. But adaptation comes at a cost. Because the more one aligns with the current continuity, the more the suppressed layers begin to distort perception. Small discrepancies accumulate, moments of recognition that cannot be placed. A sense that something is missing, not in a concrete way, but as a persistent absence that cannot be fully articulated. This absence becomes a quiet pressure. It does not disrupt action directly, but it alters the context in which action occurs. Decisions are made within a field that is subtly misaligned. The individual operates with an awareness that the structure they inhabit is not fully reliable, even if it appears stable. This is where the legacy of the crisis begins to manifest in behavior. Heroes become more cautious, not in the sense of hesitation, but in the sense of recognizing that the consequences of action may extend beyond what can be perceived. The idea that reality itself can be altered introduces a new dimension of responsibility. Actions are no longer confined to immediate outcomes. They exist within a system that can be reconfigured. This changes the scale of decision-making. Conflicts that would once be localized now carry an implicit weight, not because they directly threaten the structure of reality, but because the possibility of structural disruption has been established. Every action occurs within the shadow of that possibility. At the same time, there is a counter-movement, a tendency toward normalization, toward re-establishing the illusion of permanence. The system encourages this. It reinforces continuity through repetition, through the reassertion of familiar patterns, through the maintenance of a narrative that presents itself as stable and enduring. This creates a dual dynamic. On one level, there is an awareness of fragility. On another, there is a pressure to ignore that fragility in order to function. The heroes exist between these levels, navigating a reality that requires both recognition and suppression of its own instability. And this dynamic extends beyond individual characters. It shapes the entire structure of the narrative moving forward. Stories begin to operate with an implicit tension between continuity and disruption. Events are framed within a stable world, but there is always the underlying possibility that this stability is provisional, that what exists now can be altered, rewritten, or erased under certain conditions. This possibility is rarely addressed directly, because to do so would destabilize the narrative itself. Instead, it operates as a background condition, influencing the way events are perceived, the way stakes are understood, the way consequences are interpreted. The audience becomes aware, at some level, that the world they are observing is not fixed, that it has already been rewritten once and could be again. This awareness introduces a form of meta-instability. The boundary between narrative and structure becomes permeable. The story is no longer just about what happens within the world, but about the conditions that allow that world to exist in the first place. The crisis has exposed those conditions, even if the narrative does not explicitly revisit them. And this exposure cannot be undone, because once the possibility of erasure is introduced, it becomes part of the framework. Even if it is not activated, it remains present as a latent force. The system continues to function, but it does so with an awareness of its own vulnerability. This vulnerability reshapes the concept of heroism, no longer defined solely by the ability to overcome threats within the world, but by the capacity to operate within a world that may not be stable. To act, knowing that the ground beneath that action may not be permanent. To commit to a reality that has already been proven to be contingent. This introduces a new kind of resilience. Not the resilience of endurance within a stable system, but the resilience of coherence within an unstable one. The ability to maintain identity, purpose, and action, even when the structure that supports them is uncertain. And this resilience is not uniform. Some characters adapt more easily, integrating the instability into their understanding of the world. Others struggle, experiencing the dissonance more acutely, unable to fully align with a reality that contradicts their memory. Some choose to forget, whether consciously or unconsciously, allowing the system to reassert its coherence within their perception. Each response reflects a different way of coping with the same underlying condition, a universe that has been erased and rebuilt, and this condition continues to shape everything that follows. Because the crisis does not end with the defeat of the anti-monitor. It persists as a structural feature of the narrative, a foundational event that redefines the parameters within which all future events will occur. The universe continues, but it does so with a history that is both present and absent, a continuity that is both real and constructed, a stability that is both functional and provisional. And those who inhabit it must navigate that contradiction, not as a temporary challenge, but as a permanent condition. When the crisis concluded within the narrative, its effects did not remain confined to the fictional universe. They extended outward into the structures of perception that govern how stories are consumed, remembered, and believed. What had occurred was not simply a large-scale event within a comic book continuity. It was a redefinition of what continuity itself could mean. Before this moment, serialized storytelling operated under an implicit agreement with its audience. Worlds evolved, histories accumulated, contradictions were tolerated, but the underlying assumption of persistence remained intact. Even when narratives became complex or inconsistent, There was a sense that everything belonged to a single expanding structure. Time moved forward. Events layered upon one another. The past remained accessible, even if it was occasionally revised or reinterpreted. The crisis disrupted that agreement. It demonstrated, within the narrative itself, that continuity was not an organic accumulation, but a construct that could be dismantled and rebuilt. Entire histories could be erased, not as retcons hidden in editorial decisions, but as explicit events within the story. The audience was no longer simply observing a world that evolved. They were witnessing a system that could be rewritten from within. This introduced a new kind of awareness. Readers began to perceive continuity not as a fixed timeline, but as a flexible architecture. The past was no longer guaranteed. The present was no longer anchored. The future was no longer a linear extension of what had come before. Instead, everything existed within a structure that could be altered, condensed, or expanded according to forces both internal and external to the narrative. This awareness reshaped the relationship between audience and story. Engagement shifted from immersion in a stable world to navigation of a mutable one. The reader was no longer simply following events. They were interpreting layers, distinguishing between versions, recognizing patterns of reconstruction. The act of reading became analytical, even when it remained emotional. There was always an underlying recognition that what was being presented was not necessarily permanent. And this recognition introduced a subtle form of detachment. Not a loss of investment, but a change in its nature. Attachment to characters and events became more complex, because their persistence was no longer guaranteed by the structure of the narrative. A character could be central, iconic, essential, and still be erased or redefined. A history could be foundational, deeply embedded, and still be rewritten. This did not diminish the significance of these elements. It reframed it. Meaning was no longer derived from permanence, but from impact within a given configuration. A story mattered not because it would endure unchanged, but because of what it produced within the moment it existed. Emotional weight became tied to experience rather than continuity. This shift aligns with a broader cultural movement. The late 20th century, in which Crisis on Infinite Earths emerged, was marked by increasing awareness of fragmentation in systems that had previously been perceived as stable. Political structures, cultural identities, media narratives, all began to reveal their underlying complexity and susceptibility to change. The idea of a single, coherent, unchanging framework became harder to sustain. Within this context, the crisis functions as a symbolic condensation of that cultural shift. It takes the abstract notion of systemic instability and renders it visible within a narrative structure. It shows, in concrete terms, what it means for a system to collapse and be reassembled. It makes the invisible mechanisms of reconstruction part of the story itself. And in doing so, it changes how stories can operate. After the crisis, the possibility of large-scale restructuring becomes embedded within the medium. Reboots, retellings, alternate timelines all become more than editorial tools. They become narrative possibilities that can be explored within the fiction itself. The boundary between story and structure becomes permeable. This permeability introduces a new dimension of symbolic meaning. Characters are no longer just participants in events. They become carriers of continuity across different configurations. Their identity is not fixed to a single history, but extends across multiple versions, each reflecting different aspects of the same core. The hero becomes an archetype that persists even as its manifestations change. This persistence across variation reinforces a deeper symbolic function. The character is no longer defined by a specific set of events, but by a pattern of behavior, a structure of response, a recognizable configuration of traits that can be reinterpreted in different contexts. This allows the character to remain relevant even as the narrative around them shifts. At the same time, it introduces a tension. Because if identity is no longer tied to a single continuity, what anchors it? What prevents it from dissolving into abstraction? What ensures that the character remains coherent across different iterations? This is where the legacy of the crisis continues to operate. It establishes a framework in which identity is both stable and unstable. Stable in its core pattern, unstable in its specific manifestations. The character persists, but the context changes. The meaning remains, but the form evolves. This duality reflects a broader cultural dynamic. Modern identity is increasingly understood as something that is both continuous and constructed. Individuals maintain a sense of self, but that self is shaped by shifting contexts, changing environments, evolving narratives. The idea of a fixed, unchanging identity becomes less tenable. In this sense, the post-crisis universe mirrors contemporary experience. It presents a world that appears coherent, but is built on layers of reconstruction. A world in which the past is both present and absent, in which identity is both stable and fluid, in which continuity is both maintained and disrupted. This mirroring enhances the symbolic resonance of the narrative. The crisis becomes more than a story about the destruction of universes. It becomes a representation of how systems, whether they are fictional worlds or cultural frameworks, respond to instability. How they collapse, how they reorganize, how they maintain coherence in the face of fragmentation. And this representation extends to the way audiences engage with the material. Communities form around different interpretations of continuity. Debates emerge over what constitutes the true version of a character or event. These discussions are not merely about preference. They reflect a deeper engagement with the instability of the narrative structure. The audience becomes part of the system. Their interpretations, their attachments, their debates contribute to the ongoing construction of meaning. The story is no longer a closed system. It is an open field in which meaning is negotiated, contested, and redefined. This process amplifies the symbolic weight of the crisis. It is not just an event that happened within a story. It is a reference point that continues to shape how stories are told and understood. It becomes a foundational moment that redefines the parameters of the medium. And at its core, it carries a simple but unsettling implication. If a universe can be erased and replaced, then continuity is not a given. It is a choice, a construction, a narrative decision that can be altered. This realization does not resolve itself. It persists. It becomes part of the background against which all subsequent narratives are experienced. Even when not explicitly invoked, it influences perception. It shapes expectations. It alters the way meaning is derived from events. The universe continues to exist. The stories continue to unfold. But the awareness remains. Reality within this framework is not permanent. It is maintained. What remains after the crisis is not resolution. It is sediment. The universe that continues forward does so with a kind of surface coherence that masks the depth of what has been displaced. Structures are rebuilt, narratives resume, identities stabilize within the new continuity. The system presents itself as functional, even seamless. From within, it appears as though the rupture has been absorbed, as though the collapse has been integrated into a new, sustainable order. But this is not integration in the full sense. It is compression. The past has not been reconciled. It has been condensed into a form that allows the present to operate without constant interruption. The contradictions, the multiplicities, the erased realities, all of it has been folded into a singular narrative that must carry the weight of everything that came before, without visibly breaking under it. And this weight does not disappear. It settles. It becomes part of the foundation, not as an active force, but as a latent pressure that continues to influence the structure from beneath. The universe stands, but it stands on a history that has been both preserved and erased. A paradox that does not resolve, only stabilizes. This is where the true legacy of the crisis begins to take shape. Not in the event itself, but in the conditions it creates for everything that follows. Because once a system has been rewritten, it cannot return to a state of unquestioned continuity. The knowledge of its own malleability becomes part of its structure. Even if that knowledge is not consciously acknowledged, it exists as a background condition, shaping the way the system operates. This introduces a permanent shift in how reality is experienced within the narrative. Events are no longer understood solely in terms of their immediate consequences. They are also understood in relation to the possibility of structural change. The idea that the entire framework can be altered introduces a new dimension of uncertainty, one that cannot be fully eliminated. And this uncertainty becomes normalized. Characters continue to act, to fight, to make decisions, but they do so within a reality that has already demonstrated its capacity for erasure and reconstruction. The ground beneath their actions is no longer assumed to be stable. It is treated as stable for the sake of function, but the assumption is no longer absolute. This creates a subtle form of vigilance, not an overt awareness, not a constant preoccupation, but a background sensitivity to the possibility of disruption. The system operates, but it does so with an underlying recognition that its operation is contingent. This contingency reshapes the meaning of continuity. Continuity is no longer the natural state of the universe. It is an achieved state, something that must be maintained, not simply inherited. The persistence of the narrative becomes an active process, even if it is not explicitly framed as such. And this process is not entirely within the control of the characters. It exists at the level of the structure itself, influenced by forces that operate beyond the immediate narrative. Editorial decisions, audience reception, cultural shifts, all of these factors contribute to the ongoing construction of continuity. The universe is not just maintained from within, it is maintained from without. This dual maintenance reinforces the sense that reality, in this context, is layered. There is the internal logic of the story, in which characters act and events unfold. And there is the external logic of the medium, in which the structure of the story is shaped, revised, and sometimes rebuilt. The crisis makes this layering visible, even if only indirectly. And once visible, it cannot be unseen. This visibility alters the way meaning is generated. Stories are no longer interpreted solely within their own boundaries. They are understood in relation to the structures that produce them. The audience becomes aware of the conditions under which narratives are created, altered, and preserved. This awareness does not diminish the impact of the stories, but it complicates it. Meaning becomes multi-layered. A single event can be experienced as part of the narrative, as a structural adjustment, and as a cultural signal, all at once. The crisis operates at all of these levels simultaneously, and its legacy persists because it continues to inform how each of these levels is perceived. Within the narrative, it establishes a precedent. The universe can be rewritten. This precedent does not need to be invoked repeatedly to remain effective. Its existence is enough. It becomes part of the underlying logic of the world, a possibility that can be activated when necessary. Future events that involve restructuring, rebooting, or reinterpreting continuity all operate within the space that the crisis created. And this space is not neutral. It carries the weight of what was lost. Every subsequent restructuring echoes the original event, even if the details differ. The memory of the first collapse, whether explicit or implicit, informs the perception of each new change. The system accumulates not only events, but patterns of transformation. These patterns become part of its identity. The universe is no longer defined solely by what happens within it, but by how it changes. Its history is not just a sequence of events, but a series of reconfigurations. Each one leaves a trace, even if that trace is not fully accessible within the narrative. and this accumulation creates a kind of narrative gravity. The more the system is rewritten, the more its instability becomes an integral part of its structure. Continuity persists, but it does so in a way that acknowledges its own fluidity. The universe becomes a space in which change is not an exception, but a defining characteristic. This has implications for how characters are understood. They are no longer fixed entities moving through a stable world. They are points of continuity within a changing structure. Their identity is maintained not through unbroken history, but through recognizable patterns that persist across different configurations. This persistence allows them to function as anchors. Even as the world around them shifts, they provide a sense of continuity that can be followed. The audience recognizes them, even when their context changes. This recognition becomes a stabilizing force within an otherwise fluid system. But this stability is partial, because the characters themselves are subject to the same processes of reconstruction. Their histories can be altered, their identities reinterpreted, their roles reshaped. The anchor holds, but it is not fixed in place. It moves with the structure, and this movement reinforces the central tension. Continuity and change are no longer opposites. They are interdependent. The system maintains itself by changing, and it changes in order to maintain itself. The crisis reveals this dynamic, and its legacy ensures that it remains active. There is no return to a pre-crisis state, not because it is impossible, but because the conditions that define that state have been permanently altered. The assumption of a stable, accumulating continuity has been replaced by the recognition of a constructed, mutable one. And this recognition persists. It shapes how stories are told, how characters are developed, how audiences engage with the material. It becomes part of the cultural fabric of the medium, influencing not only what is created, but how it is interpreted. The universe continues, but it does so with an awareness embedded in its structure. It has already ended once, and it continues anyway,